Before kicking off any BI project, there are many questions that need to be answered. For instance, what is the scope? What is the best way to proceed? How long would this BI program take? How much will it cost? How much do we have to spend? Who do we need to interview? And who needs to be involved? An assessment, therefore, helps us answer these questions and keep a project on track. And this can be done either internally, or sometimes companies might hire external consultant to do these assessments. The end result of these assessments is a BI roadmap or BI program to achieve the objectives of the client and in a manner that's most resource efficient and also as much as possible cost effective. To develop a roadmap, we need to examine 4 subject areas in sufficient details. First, we need to have an assessment of business and IT requirement. Then we look at the architecture, the 4 elements of architecture related to data, information, technology, and products. We need to assess organizational skills. We need to think of the resources that's available. And finally, we need to have an assessment of the project, the scope, and the deliverables, and the schedule, and find ways to mitigate risks of this project. Here is a more detailed depiction of BI assessment. At a higher level, there are 3 dimensions that are related to architecture. So we have to cover those architectures, issues related to business and IT in terms of identifying the requirements, and then related to the people, basically the organization, the governance, managing the projects, and the skills required for the project. So the way it works, BI assessment consists of 3 phases. We have discovery. In discovery, we do interviews, we have discussions with relevant people, we look at the systems that exist at the moment in the company, we look at the sources of data, the systems, the integration technologies, the quality of data, the resources available, and the infrastructure. We analyze the information we collect from this discovery, and the outcome of this analysis would be a set of recommendations. So the way it works, we usually set up meetings with the representatives from stakeholders of the project, and we provide an assessment, we provide an overview of our assessment. It could be in form of, let's say, gap analysis, or basically identifying the current state versus the desired state, looking at the future architecture and best practices. And what we do is that through this basically communication with the stakeholders, we receive some feedback, and then based on that feedback, we come out and basically revise our program. Now let's look at these 3 stages in a little more detail. The discovery phase is where we do an assessment of the current BI environment in the organization. In the analysis phase, we do a comparison of the current state versus the future state. And in the recommendation phase, we look at the scope of the project that we have intended, the priorities, and also we set out the budget. And again, our goal at the end of recommendation phase is to be able to present these results to the steering committee and receive the budget that we have in mind. Now, in terms of the activities that are going to happen in discovery, I'm not going to go over the details of each of these elements, but in general, related to business and IT, we need to collect information about the business strategy and goals, and also standards and priorities of the IT department. basically we come up with a business and IT set of priorities and value propositions. We'll also look at the architecture of the existing environment in the organization. So we look at these 4 elements and we come up with an assessment of the current state. And finally, with regard to organization, we do an appraisal of the initiatives, the strategy, the vision. We look at the resources that's available, and we look at the skills that are available. And basically, we put together an assessment of the current state of the organization. And what we do is that as a result of this, we have a document, basically some sort of analysis of the current state. The analysis is where we look at what we have discovered, and we use those the input from the previous step in order to identify the gaps. And then we also look at the architecture of the system we have in mind versus what we have, and we try to come up with basically what would be our distance from the future architecture, a gap analysis again. And same thing we do with the resources. We look at what we have in the organization in terms of resources and what we're missing. And finally, in the recommendation phase, we have again, we identify the potential solutions for the issues that we have identified related to resources, related to the information architecture, the data architecture, technical architecture, and product architecture, as well as the people that are involved. And then we come up with recommendations. For instance, we might want to do some training. We might have to do improve our architecture. We have to invest in our architecture, things like that. And then again, we present these results, we receive feedback, and then through this communication, we try to get as close as possible to and receive as much as possible the resources that we think are going to be needed for the successful implementation of this BI program. So part of, again, this stage is basically marketing the project that you have in mind. Now, in a lot of projects, there's a tendency that a project manager would develop a detailed project schedule before any work has started. Now, if a project manager does not have much experience with BI and DW, this is going to be a very difficult task. And that's why I mentioned earlier, it's important that a BI project manager is familiar with implementation and development of BI project. Now, the best approach to our project management is to put together and define what's known as a work breakdown structure, or WBS document. And we try to basically put together a schedule of the progress of the project. And there are different WBS documents we can develop related to the program itself, related to the project, and related to the architecture. This is an example of the stages we might want to consider in developing a BI project WBS. So we think about the scope and plan, analysis, then building and testing, implementing, and then deploying and rollout. These are the common steps of developing a BI project. You can see them all over here again too. So these are BI project phases in general. And now if we think of the 4 levels of architecture, for instance, we have to think about our WBS should focus on how each architecture is going to develop and advance across these different phases. And that's where, again, it requires a little bit of experience. And that's where complexity comes into place with regard to developing a project. Now, in terms of how project advances through phases, we might think of project methodologies. Basically, project methodology is the way or the set of processes we follow in order to put together a software system. most of you are familiar with project methodologies. You might have seen these concepts in other courses, but the two basic methods to develop a software are, one is waterfall, which uses a sequential or linear approach. Basically, we follow each of these steps sequentially, and the output of each step needs to be verified by the steering committee and be approved. We usually really don't go back through this process, so it's kind of time consuming and it's very thorough, but it's helpful if we are dealing with a lot of complexity in our project. But at the same time, what's really common in the industry now is an agile methodology, which is an iterative, team-based approach towards software development. And in order to develop a project, the requirements and deliverables are basically split into a set of functions based on the time it takes to complete them. For instance, we set what's known as a Scrum for like 2 weeks to 4 weeks, and then we set a number of functionalities we can develop through that time period. If we are fast enough, if we are really speeding up through this development, we might be able to add some functions, but we don't really change the time aspect of the Scrum in Agile methodology. Same thing, if some of the functions appear to be more complex, we might drop some additional functions. Another thing that's involved in Agile methodology is a lot of feedback. We have these quick cycles, and at the end of each cycle, we'll receive feedback. So collaboration, communication is very important, and the teams that might help us develop a software in Agile require a lot of expertise. I will attach another video that shows basically distinction between two methods better. But overall, waterfall and Agile are again common. Agile, I would say it's more common at the moment. The scope is an enterprise or business process. In Agile methodology, the scope is usually more limited, and we have a limited number of people because of, again, these short cycles and collaboration and communication that's required. The project should be very well defined, data should be well defined, functionality should be well defined, whereas in Agile, it's assumed in place, and basically we set these requirements as we go along the project. So it's great for dashboards, visualizations, reports, whereas enterprise or transaction-oriented applications are better developed in terms of with regard to waterfall methodology. Now, beside these, there are also other methods that are being used. They are kind of hybrid methods, mix of waterfall and Agile. I would say more leaning toward Agile methodology. We have incremental development. We have a spiral development, so basically a mix of waterfall and prototyping. So we establish some prototypes, but with quicker cycles, when we go through all the common steps of developing a methodology, so defining, building, then releasing, and then testing. And in each step, we kind of advance our prototype. We have rapid application development. It's another iterative methodology that uses prototype. We have also object-oriented or unified model. Again, the details of each of these methods is outside of our scope, but it's good to know at least the distinction between waterfall and Agile methodologies.